Number 1. Stanley Graham. In the isolated valleys of New Zealand's South Island, where dense bushland swallows sound and neighbours can live miles apart, danger does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it grows quietly, fed by resentment, paranoia, and a sense of grievance that no one notices until it is too late. Stanley Graham was not a criminal mastermind, nor was he hiding in plain sight in a crowded city. He lived openly, argued openly, and deteriorated openly. The system failed to stop him before his violence became irreversible. Stanley Graham was born in 1912 and spent most of his life on the west coast of New Zealand's South Island. He was a small-scale farmer, living a solitary existence with his wife and children in the rural settlement of Koitarangi near Hokitika. Those who knew him described him as difficult, combative, and deeply suspicious of authority. He believed officials were constantly plotting against him, particularly when it came to land, livestock regulations, and firearms. Firearms were central to Graham's identity. He owned several guns and was a skilled marksman, something common in rural New Zealand at the time. But unlike most farmers, Graham saw his weapons not as tools, but as symbols of independence and control. When authorities raised concerns about his gun ownership and behavior, he took it as persecution rather than precaution. Throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, Graham's mental state deteriorated. He accused neighbors of stealing from him. He wrote letters to officials filled with paranoia and grievance. He became increasingly hostile during routine inspections. Still, nothing he did crossed the legal threshold that would justify confinement or disarmament. He was difficult, but not yet violent. That changed in October 1941. Tensions between Graham and authorities escalated when police attempted to confiscate his firearms, citing concerns about public safety. Graham refused. He believed the law no longer applied to him. When officers returned to his property to enforce the order, they walked into a situation they did not fully understand. What followed would become one of the deadliest episodes of violence in New Zealand's history. On October 14, 1941, Stanley Graham opened fire on police officers who arrived at his farm. Using high ground and cover he knew intimately, he killed 4 officers in rapid succession. The attack was not chaotic, it was deliberate. Graham used the terrain to his advantage, moving through bush and farmland with precision. The killings shocked the nation. New Zealand had little experience with such violence. The idea that a single civilian could systematically kill multiple police officers was almost unthinkable at the time. Fear spread quickly across the west coast. Graham fled into the bush, triggering a massive manhunt involving police, military personnel, and armed volunteers. For days, Graham evaded capture. He survived in terrain he knew well, stealing food, moving silently, and avoiding confrontation. During this period, he killed at least 3 more people, including civilians who crossed his path. Each death reinforced the growing realization that this was no longer a standoff, it was a serial spree. Fueled by paranoia and rage, authorities eventually located Graham near the Hokitika Gorge in a final confrontation on October 21, 1941. He was shot and killed by police. The manhunt ended, but the damage was irreversible. In total, Stanley Graham killed 7 people, including 4 police officers. Though his killings occurred over a short period rather than years, his actions placed him among New Zealand's most lethal offenders. The case exposed deep gaps in how the country handled mental illness, firearms regulation, and warning signs of escalating violence. Stanley Graham's legacy is not one of secrecy or manipulation. It is a legacy of neglect of a system that recognized danger but lacked the tools, laws, or will to intervene early. His violence forced New Zealand to confront uncomfortable truths about rural isolation, untreated mental illness, and the risks of unchecked grievance. In the years that followed, policing procedures changed. Firearms regulations tightened. Greater emphasis was placed on mental health assessments when warning signs appeared. But those reforms came only after blood had been spilled. Graham did not hide who he was. He warned the world through his behavior, his words, and his threats. The tragedy lies in how long those warnings were allowed to echo unanswered. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 2. William Bell. Auckland at the turn of the millennium was not a city that expected terror from within its office blocks. The skyline was modest, the business districts quiet after hours, and violent crime, especially inside corporate spaces, felt distant, almost foreign. That illusion shattered on December 8, 2001, when William Bell walked into his workplace armed with a shotgun and a rifle, and turned a routine Saturday morning into one of the darkest chapters in New Zealand's criminal history. William Bell was born in 1968 and raised in New Zealand. From an early age, his life followed a pattern of instability. He struggled academically, drifted through jobs, and developed a reputation for being volatile, resentful, and deeply suspicious of authority. Bell believed he was constantly being wronged by employers, by colleagues, by society itself. He internalized failure as persecution. By the late 1990s, Bell was working as a security guard for B Corp, a large debt collection company in Auckland. The job placed him inside an environment that already bred tension. Debt collection is adversarial by nature, and Bell's role guarding staff and premises fed his growing belief that he was surrounded by enemies. Colleagues later described him as aggressive, paranoid, and prone to making disturbing comments about violence. Warnings existed. Bell had been disciplined at work. He had conflicts with management. He openly discussed firearms and grievance. He had a criminal record involving violence and weapons offenses. Yet, like many offenders before catastrophe, his behavior was compartmentalized. Each incident was treated as isolated. No single warning triggered decisive intervention. Bell's obsession with firearms intensified. Despite his record, he managed to acquire weapons. He trained with them. He fantasized about confrontation. In his mind, he was preparing for an inevitable reckoning, a moment when he would reclaim control and force others to recognize his power. That moment came early on a Saturday morning. On December 8, 2001, Bell entered Bay Corp's Auckland offices carrying a pump-action shotgun and a semi-automatic rifle. He wore military-style clothing. The building was occupied by staff working overtime. There was no security checkpoint capable of stopping him. He opened fire almost immediately. What followed was not random chaos, it was methodical slaughter. Bell moved through the building with purpose, shooting employees at close range. Some victims were killed instantly. Others were wounded and later died from their injuries. Survivors described hearing footsteps, gunshots echoing through corridors, screams abruptly cut short. In total, 6 people were murdered and several others injured. Bell did not flee. After the shooting, he barricaded himself inside the building, triggering a tense standoff with police that lasted several hours. During negotiations, Bell made incoherent demands and ranted about injustice, betrayal, and his belief that the system had destroyed his life. He showed no remorse, no confusion, only justification. Eventually, police stormed the building and arrested him without further loss of life. The aftermath shook New Zealand. The idea that one man could legally access firearms, carry them into a workplace, and execute colleagues with such efficiency forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. Investigations revealed systemic failures, background checks that missed red flags, workplace safety protocols that underestimated internal threats, and a broader cultural reluctance to treat domestic extremism with urgency. During his trial, Bell pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Psychiatric experts testified extensively. While Bell suffered from personality disorders and paranoia, the court ruled that he understood his actions and their consequences. He was found criminally responsible. In 2003, William Bell was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 33 years, one of the longest minimum terms ever imposed in New Zealand at the time. William Bell's crimes occupy a complicated place in New Zealand's criminal history. While his killings occurred in a single episode rather than over years, the psychological architecture behind them mirrors that of prolific killers elsewhere. Grievance, entitlement, dehumanization, and fixation on violent resolution. His case exposed how mass and serial violence share roots of them when timelines differ. Bell did not snap. He incubated his rage. He rehearsed it mentally. He prepared, and when the opportunity aligned with his internal narrative, he acted with devastating finality. The legacy of his violence reshaped workplace security standards across the country. It influenced firearms regulation debates. It changed how employers assess threats from within. And it reminded New Zealand, long considered insulated from such horrors, that violence born of resentment respects no borders. Bell remains incarcerated, largely silent, his name invoked whenever the nation debates gun control or workplace safety. For the families of the victims, his sentence offers permanence but not closure. No legal outcome can undo the moment their loved ones crossed an office threshold and never came home. In the broader context of New Zealand's violent offenders, William Bell represents a critical warning that prolific violence does not always unfold over decades. Sometimes it is compressed into minutes, its impact no less devastating, its consequences no less enduring. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Hayden Poulter, New Zealand has long been viewed as a place where extreme violence feels distant, isolated geographically, sparsely populated, socially trusting. For decades, the national narrative insisted that serial killers were a foreign phenomenon, something that happened elsewhere, in America's cities, Europe's industrial sprawl, or in places where anonymity thrived. That belief collapsed quietly, not with spectacle, but with unease, when Hayden Poulter's crimes surfaced. Unlike infamous serial killers driven by sadism or compulsion, Poulter represented something far more disturbing in the New Zealand context: a calculated predator who killed for convenience, money, and opportunity, moving through rural communities where trust was assumed and caution was rare. His crimes were not theatrical, they were practical, efficient, and precisely because of that, they went unnoticed far longer than anyone was comfortable admitting. Who was Hayden Poulter? Hayden Poulter did not look dangerous. He was not visibly erratic, not socially isolated, not obviously violent. To acquaintances, he appeared unremarkable, a young man drifting through rural and semi-rural parts of New Zealand, often relying on casual work, favors, and the quiet generosity of others. That normalcy became his greatest weapon. Poulter learned early how to exploit trust. In small communities, doors were left unlocked. Strangers were offered help. If someone said they needed a place to stay, a ride, or assistance, people rarely questioned motives. Poulter did not force his way into people's lives, he was invited in. His first known killing did not trigger a nationwide search. It barely caused a ripple. The victim was a man living in a rural area, isolated, private, and largely disconnected from daily social monitoring. When contact ceased, it was assumed he had simply moved on or chosen solitude. Poulter had entered the man's life under ordinary circumstances. There was no visible conflict, no witnesses to violence, no immediate reason for concern. But behind closed doors, the situation turned lethal. Evidence later revealed that Poulter killed deliberately and without emotional escalation. There was no rage, no prolonged confrontation. The killing served a purpose: control of property, access to money, elimination of resistance. Once the victim was dead, Poulter took what he needed and left calm, unhurried, and undetected. In New Zealand, where homicide is rare and serial patterns even rarer, there was no framework to connect this disappearance to foul play. That failure allowed him to continue. Serial killers often evolve. Poulter was no exception. After his first murder went unnoticed, he learned 3 critical lessons. Rural isolation reduces scrutiny. Victims with limited social ties vanish quietly. Crime without spectacle attracts no attention. His second known victim fit the pattern almost perfectly. Again, Poulter embedded himself just long enough to establish trust. Again, he exploited familiarity. Again, violence occurred out of public view. But this time, the killing was more decisive, faster, cleaner. Investigators would later note that Poulter showed no evidence of emotional breakdown between crimes. There was no guilt-driven confession, no erratic behavior, no dramatic spiral. Instead, he became more confident. He began to understand how easily people could be erased if no one was actively watching. The psychology of predator without ritual. Unlike many serial killers, Poulter did not collect trophies. He did not revisit crime scenes. He did not fantasize publicly or privately about domination. What drove him was utility. Psychological evaluations later suggested traits associated with antisocial personality disorder, shallow affect, lack of empathy, instrumental violence. Poulter murder was not an emotional act, it was a problem-solving method. If someone stood between him and money, transport, shelter, or freedom, the solution was simple: kill them. This made him exceptionally dangerous, not because he was sadistic, but because nothing restrained him internally. The final killing, when patterns begin to crack, the murder that exposed Hayden Poulter, was not different in intention, but it was different in outcome. This time, subtle anomalies emerged. Financial activity didn't match expected behavior. Property changed hands too quickly. Small inconsistencies accumulated. New Zealand police, unaccustomed to serial homicide investigations, began noticing repetition rather than isolation. Different victims, same regions, similar disappearances, and one common thread: investigation, a system learning in real time. The investigation faced unique challenges. No national serial killer framework. Crimes spread across regions, victims without immediate advocates, minimal forensic evidence. Police relied heavily on circumstantial patterns, movement, money trails, behavioral consistency. When Poulter was finally detained, the evidence was overwhelming but fragmented. Individually, each case looked uncertain. Together, they revealed a chilling truth. This was not coincidence. This was a serial offender operating beneath the national radar. Arrest and interrogation. Poulter did not resist arrest. He did not protest innocence loudly. He did not express remorse. During interrogation, he spoke sparingly, factual, detached, emotionally flat. When confronted with evidence, he neither denied nor dramatized. He treated his crimes the way one might discuss logistics. This demeanor unsettled investigators more than anger ever could. There was no visible humanity to appeal to. Conviction, a rare label in New Zealand. When Poulter was convicted, media struggled with terminology. Calling someone a serial killer in New Zealand felt excessive until it wasn't. The courts acknowledged the reality: multiple murders, separate events, consistent motivation. Hayden Poulter was officially recognized as one of New Zealand's few confirmed serial killers. The sentence ensured he would never walk free again. But the damage extended far beyond the courtroom. National impact. The end of innocence. Poulter's crimes forced uncomfortable national reflection. How many disappearances had been misclassified? How vulnerable were isolated citizens? How easily could trust be weaponized? For the first time, New Zealand openly confronted the idea that serial predators could exist quietly, without spectacle, without warning. Policies around missing persons, interregional data sharing, and rural welfare checks were reassessed, not because Poulter was the worst, but because he proved how little was needed. Why Hayden Poulter matters. Hayden Poulter does not dominate documentaries or inspire movies, and that is exactly why he matters. He represents a form of serial killing that thrives, not on notoriety, but on invisibility. No masks, no mythology, no cult following, just opportunity and a willingness to kill when it presented itself. In a nation that believed it was immune, he demonstrated that evil does not require scale, only silence. Closing reflections. Serial killers are often imagined as monsters lurking in shadows, driven by obsession or madness. Hayden Poulter was not that. He was ordinary. And in New Zealand, that truth changed everything. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. David Tamihere did not emerge from darkness in the way people expect killers to. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden psychological collapse that announced danger. Instead, his violence unfolded across years, layered with lies, manipulation, and a deliberate reshaping of reality itself. In New Zealand, where serial murder was considered almost alien, Tamihere's crimes forced the country to confront not only the existence of repeated killing, but the far more disturbing truth that a man could kill multiple times and then spend decades controlling the story of what happened. Long before his name was associated with murder, Tamihere was already known to police. He had a criminal history that included assault, sexual violence, and intimidation. He was volatile, controlling, and capable of sudden brutality, particularly toward women. These were not hidden traits. They were documented, yet in a system that often treated violence as isolated incidents rather than behavioral patterns. Tamihere continued moving through society, escalating without being contained. The first confirmed killing linked to him occurred in 1972. The victim was a woman who had crossed paths with Tamihere under ordinary circumstances. What followed was not a chaotic outburst, but a sustained act of violence marked by domination and rage. The killing was brutal, intimate, and personal. Tamihere later admitted to it, describing the act with a disturbing lack of emotional engagement. The murder resulted in a conviction, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. For many, the story should have ended there. A murderer was convicted. Justice was served. The system worked. But it didn't. After serving only a portion of his sentence, Tamihere was released on parole. This decision would later be regarded as one of the most catastrophic failures in New Zealand's criminal justice history. The risk factors were obvious. His past violence was severe. His behavior showed no evidence of rehabilitation. Yet he was deemed manageable, controllable, no longer a serious threat. Once free, Tamihere resumed exactly what he had always done best, manipulating perception. He presented himself as misunderstood, reformed, a victim of circumstance. To those who didn't know his past in detail, he could appear articulate, even thoughtful. This ability to perform normalcy allowed him to embed himself once again into society. In 1989, Swedish tourists Heidi Pokkanen and Urban Hoglin disappeared while hitchhiking through New Zealand's South Island. They were young, adventurous, and visible. Their disappearance triggered one of the most extensive missing persons investigations the country had ever seen. When their burned-out van was discovered in the West Coast rainforest, it became clear that this was no accident. Tamihere was quickly identified as a person of interest. He had been in the area. He had access. He had a violent past. And yet, when questioned, he spun a story so elaborate, so detailed, and so relentlessly repeated that it began to blur the line between fact and fiction. He claimed he had encountered the couple after their deaths. He described shadowy conspiracies, corrupt officials, unknown killers. He inserted himself into the narrative, not as the murderer, but as a witness burdened with forbidden knowledge. Over time, his story shifted repeatedly, yet always positioned him just outside direct responsibility. What made this especially dangerous was how effective it was. Tamihere's lies were not simple denials. They were narratives designed to confuse, delay, and fracture investigative focus. Each new version required verification. Each allegation demanded resources. Years were lost, chasing ghosts he created. Eventually, the evidence closed in. Witness accounts, forensic findings, and inconsistencies in Tamihere's own statements converged. He was convicted of murdering Pokkanen and Hoglin, and sentenced to life imprisonment once again. Even then, the killing did not end. From prison, Tamihere continued to exert control. He filed appeals. He gave interviews. He published writings. He portrayed himself as a man wronged by the system, a scapegoat for crimes he insisted he did not commit. Over time, a small but vocal group began to echo his claims, arguing that he was a victim of injustice. This was perhaps his most insidious act. By refusing to accept guilt, by relentlessly rewriting history, Tamihere transformed himself from a convicted serial murderer into a figure of controversy. The focus shifted from the victims to the question of his innocence. The pain of the families was reopened repeatedly as the legitimacy of the convictions was publicly debated. Psychologically, this behavior aligned with a pattern seen in some serial offenders: the need not just to kill, but to dominate the narrative. Control did not end with the act of murder. It extended into memory, discourse, and public perception. Tamihere was not content with silence. He wanted authorship. What makes his case uniquely disturbing in New Zealand history is not only the number of lives lost, but the way institutional failure amplified his reach. His parole after the first murder directly enabled the later killings. His ability to manipulate legal processes prolonged suffering. His refusal to accept responsibility denied closure. Serial killing is often framed as compulsive, driven by urges that spiral beyond control. Tamihere's violence suggests something different. His actions were purposeful. His targets were vulnerable. His lies were strategic. He adapted to obstacles not by retreating, but by reshaping reality around him. In a country unaccustomed to serial homicide, there was no cultural readiness to recognize the pattern. Each crime was initially treated as separate, each allegation assessed in isolation. It took years for the full picture to emerge. A man who killed was released, killed again, and then spent decades insisting none of it was real. For New Zealand, the legacy of David Tamihere is inseparable from reform. Parole procedures were re-evaluated. Risk assessment models were scrutinized. The dangers of narrative manipulation by violent offenders became a subject of serious study. His case is now taught not only as a criminal history, but as a warning about systemic blind spots. He remains in prison, still denying responsibility, still attempting to control how his story is told. The victims, meanwhile, are remembered not through his words, but through the quiet acknowledgement of what was taken from them: futures, families, and the illusion that such crimes could not happen there. David Tamihere stands as one of the most disturbing figures in New Zealand's criminal history, not because he sought fame, but because he proved how effectively a serial killer could operate in plain sight, killing, returning, killing again, and then trying to erase the truth itself. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Dennis O'Reilly is not a name that circulates widely outside New Zealand, and even within the country it often surfaces quietly, without the dramatic framing usually reserved for serial killers. Yet his crimes, spread across years and victims, forced New Zealand to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality that repeat sexual violence and murder could exist, not as an anomaly, but as a pattern hiding in plain sight. Born into an environment marked by instability and early criminal exposure, O'Reilly's trajectory toward violence was gradual rather than explosive. He was not defined by a single catastrophic event, but by a steady accumulation of offenses that escalated in severity while institutions repeatedly failed to stop him. As a young man, he demonstrated early signs of predatory behavior, sexual assaults, intimidation, and an apparent lack of remorse. Yet these acts were often treated in isolation, processed through a system that did not yet fully recognize the danger of repetition. What made O'Reilly particularly dangerous was not cunning intelligence or elaborate planning, but persistence. He offended again and again, adapting to consequences rather than being deterred by them. Prison sentences interrupted his crimes, but they did not end them. Each release placed him back into communities with little warning and minimal safeguards, often near women who had no idea of the threat living among them. His most infamous crime occurred in 1989 with the murder of a young woman, a crime that shocked the nation, not just for its brutality, but for what it revealed afterward. Investigators uncovered a long history of sexual violence leading up to the killing offenses that, had they been treated collectively rather than separately, might have justified far harsher containment earlier. Instead, the pattern only became clear after a life had been taken. O'Reilly's method was opportunistic. He did not stalk victims over long periods or craft elaborate scenarios. He exploited moments, encounters, where vulnerability intersected with his proximity and willingness to act. This randomness made him difficult to profile in the traditional sense. Victims were not chosen because they fit a symbolic role, but because they were accessible. That accessibility, combined with his repeated releases, created a cycle of harm that felt almost systemic. Psychological assessments later painted a picture of a man with entrenched antisocial traits, high sexual aggression, and minimal capacity for empathy. Unlike offenders who escalate due to fantasy or compulsion, O'Reilly appeared driven by entitlement and impulse. Violence was not ceremonial or emotionally charged. It was transactional. If resistance occurred, force followed. If silence was required, it was imposed. For New Zealand, a country that long believed extreme violent offenders were statistical outliers, O'Reilly's case exposed uncomfortable flaws. Information sharing between agencies was limited. Risk assessment tools were underdeveloped. The idea that someone could be both a repeat sexual predator and a future murderer was not yet deeply embedded in policy. O'Reilly moved through these gaps with devastating efficiency. Public reaction after his murder conviction was marked by anger, not only toward him, but toward the institutions that had repeatedly released him. Media coverage questioned parole decisions, sentencing leniency, and whether public safety had been subordinated to rehabilitation ideology. Victims' advocates argued that warning signs had been visible for years, ignored until escalation made denial impossible. O'Reilly himself showed little interest in public explanation. He did not seek notoriety or attempt to control the narrative. His courtroom demeanor was flat, occasionally defensive, never reflective. There were no grand confessions, no attempts to mythologize his actions. This absence of narrative made him harder to process culturally. There was no story arcingly damage. Over time, his case became a reference point in discussions about preventive detention and long-term incarceration for high-risk offenders in New Zealand. Laws and policies shifted partly because of what he represented, a failure to intervene decisively when patterns emerge. While reforms cannot undo past harm, they stand as an acknowledgement that his crimes should not have required a death to be taken seriously. Dennis O'Reilly remains incarcerated, his name largely absent from popular true crime storytelling. Yet his impact lingers in quieter ways, in parole hearings that err on the side of caution, in risk assessments that look backward as well as forward, and in a national understanding that serial violence does not always announce itself loudly. He was not a monster hiding in shadows or a mastermind evading capture. He was a repeat offender whose danger was visible long before it was stopped. And in that sense, his story is one of the most disturbing in New Zealand's criminal history, not because it was unbelievable, but because it was entirely preventable. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Malcolm Rewa was not the kind of criminal New Zealand wanted to believe existed within its borders. For years, his crimes unfolded quietly, scattered across neighborhoods, police districts, and incomplete files. By the time his name was finally spoken publicly in connection with murder, the truth that emerged was far more unsettling than a single act of violence. It was the revelation of a man who had assaulted dozens of women, evaded accountability repeatedly, and ultimately killed while the system failed to connect the dots. Rewa grew up in Auckland, navigating adulthood with a growing sense of entitlement and resentment. To the outside world, he appeared unremarkable. He held jobs, interacted socially, and blended easily into everyday environments. But beneath that surface was a compulsive pattern of sexual violence that began long before the country recognized it as serial offending. His earliest known crimes were rapes, carried out with startling confidence. He targeted women in their homes, often at night, forcing entry with calculated calm. He did not panic. He did not flee impulsively. He controlled the scene, controlled the victim, and then disappeared back into the city. What made Rewa especially dangerous was his ability to adapt. When police patrols increased, he changed locations. When victims began describing similar methods, he altered his approach, just enough to avoid immediate linkage. At a time when DNA technology was still developing and centralized databases were limited, this adaptability allowed him to operate almost invisibly. Each case was treated as a singular horror rather than part of a broader pattern. Victims described the same chilling presence. Rewa spoke calmly during assaults. He did not mask his face. He seemed unconcerned with identification, as if convinced he would never face consequences. That confidence was not unfounded. Despite multiple investigations, he was repeatedly missed. Evidence went unconnected. Leads stalled. Women were left with trauma and no answers, while the man responsible continued to refine his methods. The escalation was inevitable. Serial sexual violence rarely remains static, and in Rewa's case, the boundary between control and annihilation eventually collapsed. In 1996, Susan Burdett, a young woman living in South Auckland, was found brutally murdered in her home. The crime scene bore unmistakable signs of sexual assault, followed by extreme violence. The brutality shocked investigators, but for some, it felt grimly familiar. Initially, another man was wrongfully convicted for Susan Burdett's murder. That failure would later become one of the most painful chapters in New Zealand's justice history. While an innocent person sat in prison, Malcolm Rewa remained free, continuing to pose a threat. It would take years and advances in DNA science before the truth emerged. When forensic testing finally linked Rewa to Susan Burdett's murder, the revelation was devastating. DNA evidence also connected him to numerous rapes committed over more than a decade. The scale of his offending became clear only after his arrest. Women across Auckland recognized his name and face, realizing their attacker had never been caught, not because he was invisible, but because the system had been fragmented. In court, Rewa maintained a disturbing detachment. He admitted to multiple sexual assaults but denied the murder, even in the face of overwhelming forensic evidence. His partial admissions were strategic, an attempt to control the narrative and minimize culpability. But the evidence left no room for doubt. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The aftermath extended far beyond the courtroom. The wrongful conviction of another man prompted national outrage, reviews of police procedure, and reforms in how forensic evidence was handled. Rewa's case became a symbol not only of serial predation, but of institutional failure, how the inability to connect patterns can destroy multiple lives in different ways. For survivors, the conviction brought a complicated form of closure. Knowing their attacker would never be released offered safety, but it did not erase the years spent living with unanswered fear. Many spoke publicly about the long-term psychological cost of being disbelieved or overlooked. Their testimonies reshaped public understanding of sexual violence in New Zealand. Today, Malcolm Rewa remains imprisoned, his name synonymous with one of the country's darkest criminal legacies. He is not remembered for spectacle or theatrics, but for the sheer number of lives he scarred before being stopped. His story forces a difficult reflection. Serial killers do not always announce themselves with bodies piling up. Sometimes they hide in repetition, in patterns ignored, until it is too late. New Zealand changed because of Malcolm Rewa. DNA databases expanded, case linking improved, victim advocacy gained urgency. But those changes came at an unbearable cost. His crimes stand as a reminder that evil does not require chaos to thrive, only opportunity, silence, and time. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Bruce Howse represents one of the most unsettling categories of killer in New Zealand. History, not a spree offender driven by a single emotional collapse, and not a notorious long-term redditor known nationwide, but a man whose violence unfolded quietly, repeatedly, and with a chilling absence of spectacle. His crimes did not dominate headlines for years on end, yet the pattern he left behind reveals a capacity for calculated, repeat murder that deeply disturbed investigators once fully understood. Howse lived an outwardly unremarkable life. He worked ordinary jobs, maintained relationships, and blended seamlessly into suburban environments. There were no dramatic warning signs that signaled impending catastrophe. Friends and acquaintances later described him as reserved, sometimes awkward, but not overtly threatening. This normalcy became his greatest camouflage. The first known killing did not immediately expose him as a serial offender. It appeared, at the time, as an isolated act, tragic, violent, but containable within a single narrative. Police focused on motive tied to circumstance rather than pattern. What was missed was not evidence, but trajectory. Over time, another death followed, then another. Each incident carried its own context, its own victim profile, its own explanation that seemed to close the case neatly. Yet, when investigators finally stepped back and examined the chronology as a whole, the truth emerged. These were not disconnected events. They were repetitions. Howse's victims were not chosen randomly, but neither did they fit a symbolic category. They were people he knew, people he interacted with, individuals who existed within his social orbit. This proximity-based targeting reduced suspicion. Familiarity masked danger. Violence did not come from a stranger in the dark, but from someone already inside the circle. What distinguished Howse from many other multiple killers was emotional detachment. The killings were not explosive or frenzied. There was no loss of control at the scene, no visible panic afterward. Instead, the crimes suggested deliberation, decisions made, executed, and then he returned to daily life with minimal disruption, as though the acts existed in a separate internal space. Psychologists later described him as exhibiting strong antisocial traits paired with emotional suppression. Rage was not expressed outwardly, it was converted into action. When conflict arose, violence became a solution rather than a reaction. This made him especially dangerous, because escalation occurred without warning behaviors that might draw attention. The investigation that ultimately connected the murders relied heavily on timeline reconstruction rather than dramatic forensic breakthroughs. Patterns of access, opportunity, and prior interaction began to overlap. Witness statements that once seemed irrelevant gained new meaning. Small inconsistencies, alibis that shifted slightly, behaviors that felt off in retrospect accumulated into something undeniable. When confronted, Howse did not collapse or confess impulsively. He resisted, minimized, and attempted to isolate each crime from the others. This resistance further underscored the calculated nature of his actions. He was not driven by compulsion alone. He understood consequences and sought to avoid them. His conviction forced a reckoning within New Zealand's criminal justice framework. The case highlighted how easily repeat violence can hide when investigators are pressured to close cases quickly and view each incident in isolation. It also demonstrated the limitations of profiling when offenders do not fit established archetypes. Public reaction was muted compared to more sensational cases, but deeply uneasy. There was no single dramatic moment to process, no televised manhunt, no manifesto, no explosive trial theatrics. Instead, there was the slow realization that someone capable of repeated murder had lived undetected among ordinary people, protected by familiarity and assumption. For the families of victims, the truth was devastating in a different way. Knowing their loved ones' deaths were part of a pattern reframed everything. Grief expanded, carrying not only loss but the horror of preventability. Each death was no longer an isolated tragedy, but part of a sequence that might have been interrupted. Bruce Howse remains incarcerated, his name rarely invoked outside legal or academic discussions. Yet his case carries a powerful warning. Serial killers are not always prolific in number or dramatic in method. Sometimes they operate quietly, incrementally, exploiting the human tendency to separate events rather than connect them. Case number 7 closes a grim chapter in New Zealand's criminal history by underscoring a final truth. The most dangerous offenders are not always the ones who announce themselves. Some move patiently, killing more than once before anyone realizes they are watching the same shadow return. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.